And this is basically the same when it comes to FTP and VO2max and VLaMax. If you have a high VO2max, it will lift up your FTP power. And if you have a high VLaMax, it will decrease your FTP power.
The Triathlon Show 169. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Sebastian Weber. Sebastian is a sports scientist and highly successful coach in both professional sports, where he has worked with athletes like Peter Sagan, Tony Martin and André Greipek, and with age group endurance athletes as well, in particular as the founder of the German coaching business Substrate, which is one of the largest, if not the largest and most successful in the country. He is also the co-founder of the physiological performance software INSCYD, which I have mentioned before in Q&A number 20, which I'll link to in the show notes, and which we'll talk about more towards the end of this interview. One of the most important factors behind Sebastian's success is his knowledge about exercise physiology and the metabolism of endurance sports, and importantly, how to apply that knowledge in practice. So that is our main topic of today. So after this episode, my hope is that you too can better understand how exercise metabolism works, but also how you can benefit from that and design your training to optimize for your particular individual physiology. So in the interview, we get into things like what functional threshold power really is, or why it exists, and how you can train to improve it. And that is through the only two variables that you really can change to improve FTP. Those two variables are VO2max, or your maximum aerobic capacity, and VLaMax, which is your glycolytic capacity. So we'll get into that and how that interplay is pretty much the only thing that determines your FTP. And that is why you need to focus on changing one or the other, perhaps both, potentially, if you want to improve your FTP, and not focus so much on the FTP itself, because that doesn't really matter. We'll also talk about how those two same variables, VO2max and VLaMax, determine your fat and carb oxidation at any intensity, including submaximal intensities. So these are critical even if you're training for an Ironman race, or it's not just, even though they have the words max or the postscripts max in them, it does not mean that it has to be maximal intensity. They are super important at any given intensity. Before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsor Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. We're still in the indoor training season, and one very common mistake that I see, and I've had some discussions with some of my athletes about this as well, when performance drops towards the end of, in particular, longer sessions indoors, is were you hydrated enough? Did you hydrate well before the workout? Did you stay hydrated enough in the workout? Precision Hydration helps you get your hydration right. It all starts with a free online sweat test that you can take on precisionhydration.com. That's where you can take a quick quiz of 10 questions, I think, which will give you a very good ballpark estimate for how much electrolytes you use in your sweat. And then depending on the duration of your indoor workout, then that can help you inform whether you should be replacing electrolytes in those sessions. And this can be particularly important if you're doing 2-a-day sessions. So let's say you do a bike workout in the morning and a run in the evening or afternoon. In that case, it makes sense to be particularly careful with how you hydrate before, during, and after your bike workout, so that you don't arrive at the run workout and are completely dehydrated. If you are going to order any of Precision Hydration's electrolyte products, use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, and I will give you your first box for free. Without any further ado, let's go into the interview with Sebastian Weber. Today's guest on that triathlon show is Sebastian Weber. Sebastian, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure, and of course, it's not the first time that we're talking, but the first time that we recorded the talk. So that will be a new one. So, can you start by just telling us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Well, I guess, when it comes to my background related to triathlon and endurance sports, so I have been, I'm a sports scientist by training. I studied sports science and actually also molecular human biology. And I have been involved in like performance assessment and coaching. Initially started out coaching like amateur recreational athletes, like in marathon running and triathlon. I guess almost 20 years ago, and then started to have my own human performance lab and coaching business called Steps in Germany, in Europe, which eventually became one of the most successful and biggest coaching businesses down there. And then some people might know me for my history in coaching and professional cycling, especially. So I've started coaching and being like the head coach or head sports scientist or performance manager, or whatever you want to call that, on teams like, if you might remember, HTC High Road, Columbia, Katusha, Cannondale, and so on. Worked with some professional triathletes as well along the way, but mostly like with cyclists like the likes of like Peter Sagan, Tony Martin, Greipel, some others. And so that has been like my main work in the past decade or 1.5 decades, so to speak. Since a couple of years, I like 2-3 years, I moved away a little bit from that. Still coach some individual athletes. Have done some work lately with like also again with triathlon, like did some stuff with guys like Cameron Worth, and then these days I'm mostly consulting and helping teams and organizations in different sports. We do a lot in swimming and professional swimming, Olympic swimming. Some help with like kayaking and all kinds of sports by now, I guess.
Yeah, and your software INSCYD is used in a lot of those sports, if not all of those sports, and we'll get to that towards the end of the interview. And I have actually talked a little bit about that in a previous episode a couple of weeks ago on one of my first Q&As. But let's get into the topic of our metabolism and how it works in endurance sports. So can you start by giving us a very brief overview of our metabolic systems that we use?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, kind of my background, or in other words, the only thing I maybe know something about. So metabolic pathways, I mean, as an overview, as you say, don't want to have this sound too much like a school here or something, but basically there are 3 metabolic systems how a muscle can produce energy. And when I say energy, I mean really the energy that you need for locomotion, that you need to swim, bike, or run. And this energy can only come from 3 different sources, so to speak. It's either by breaking down creatine phosphate, which is a pretty fast source of energy, or it's by something that's called the glycolysis, where you basically transform glucose or carbohydrate into a pyruvate or lactate. And then one of the most important things, especially for triathlon, is the aerobic metabolism, where you use oxygen to burn things, so to speak, to make it very simple. So to burn fuels, so basically you burn the pyruvate or lactate that came out of the glycolysis, or you're burning what comes out of the beta oxidation, so basically the fat metabolism. So 3 things: breaking down creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and aerobic metabolism, or if you want the more fancy way, oxidative phosphorylation, what you would call it. So that's the 3 ways, and these are the only 3 ways how energy or power is produced on the bike, on the run, in the swim. And whenever you see a power number, whenever you have a certain energy demand, then it's covered by a composition of all those 3 systems simultaneously.
Yeah. And just so that all the listeners are on the same page, glycolysis that you mentioned there as the second pathway, that's often referred to as well as the anaerobic system, because that system doesn't depend on oxygen to produce energy.
Which is true, but then it's like from those three systems, only one is aerobic, like the aerobic the oxidative phosphorylation, so aerobic system. And the anaerobic, you need to differentiate, basically. It's true, glycolysis is anaerobic, but also the breakdown of creatine phosphate is also anaerobic. So anaerobic-wise, you have two systems. However, if you want to, like from a practical application point of view, breaking down creatine phosphate is not of any significant practical application in triathlon.
Yeah, because it lasts like a couple of seconds or a few seconds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not really needed, not really important for what you're doing in triathlon.
Yeah. So can we take a few examples? Like, for example, one at different intensities is what I'm getting at. Like, how is your power composed? What is it composed of when we're working at a very high intensity versus like a moderate intensity, or maybe like a threshold intensity versus a very like an Ironman race intensity or something like that?
Well, look, I mean, the simple or short answer would be, the shorter the duration and the higher the intensity, the more you tend towards using your glycolytic and creatine phosphate systems, or the anaerobic systems. And then the longer you go and the lower intensity, obviously, the more you are depending on your aerobic systems. In general, that's true. But then how much you depend on one or the other system, that can differ tremendously from one athlete to the other, even so for the same effort. So there is not one simple answer saying, oh yeah, for a 30-minute effort, you're using whatever, 95% aerobic and 5% anaerobic or something. Because that depends on the athlete. And when I say that depends on the athlete, it doesn't mean that it's given by genetics, but that depends on the training status of the athlete, right? So it's a phenotype of the athlete, but it's basically more precisely how the athlete is trained. Like, so to speak, if you have a higher anaerobic capacity, if your ability to produce energy in the anaerobic pathway is developed on a very high level, then of course you can use this system and you will use this system, and therefore then maybe not 5%, but maybe 8% reliant on that system.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go into some metrics. VO2max, if we start there, what is it?
Well, VO2max, again, let's say the short answer that you will maybe hear everywhere is like, that's your maximum aerobic oxygen uptake. And this is what most people have heard, and this is what it's how it's accepted. But then I think we should come to the question and say, okay, why does everybody know that? Why has everybody heard of that? And why do people think it's important? And I think asking this question helps to understand why it is important and what it really is. So a little bit provocative, I could say, it's not important at all. Like, you as a triathlete, you don't need to care what your VO2max or your oxygen uptake is. What I'm trying to say with that, a little provocative, is that the oxygen uptake itself is not something we are interested in. The question we are trying to answer is how much energy, how much power, or if you want to have it in a more scientific way, how much ATP, which is like the currency for energy in the metabolism, how much of this can you produce in your aerobic metabolism? And the problem is, you cannot just take some kind of fancy sensor and stick it into the muscle and stick it into the membrane of your mitochondria, into your muscle cell, and measure this power output or this ATP production, if you want, directly. That's not really possible easily in like an athlete. The good thing is, and this is why everybody knows VO2max, that we know that it's known for decades that the amount of aerobic energy production is absolutely proportional to the amount of oxygen consumption. So that means your VO2 or your VO2max is nothing else and nothing more than just a marker for aerobic energy production, because we know which each molecule, which each milliliter, or whatever you want to call it or look at it, of oxygen you produce energy in your aerobic system. And because it's absolutely proportional, all it means is that your oxygen uptake is a marker, quantitative marker on how much energy produced in your aerobic system. And there are conversion factors you can easily convert, for example, oxygen uptake and power output, for example, right? Because that's basically what you're looking at here.
So if you bring it full circle, when you said that we don't need to care what our VO2 max is, can you explain in one sentence what you meant there? Because now you turn it around and explain that, well, it's an endurance sport with which depends highly on the aerobic metabolism, and
right,
that VO2 max is proportional to oxygen consumption.
Sorry if I add confusion here. No, what I'm saying is it is not in the first place the oxygen uptake you're interested in. It's important. The point I'm trying to make is that it's important to understand that the oxygen uptake is a marker. It is nothing else than a marker for the amount of aerobic energy production.
Yes.
And this is why you care.
Yeah.
This is why you care. This is why you want to know it. It's not per se that you're interested in oxygen uptake. You're interested in producing power in the aerobic pathway. And this is proportional to your oxygen uptake. And it only comes from a practical application again. If we would have another way, an easier way to measure that, to assess this ability of our athletes, we maybe would stick to another method. But I can buy a machine. I can go even on eBay and buy a used VO2 analyzer, or I can buy whatever VO2 Master online or whatever kind of device, and measure oxygen uptake. And thereby it becomes accessible. And thereby it becomes accessible to understand what is the capacity or the performance of my aerobic energy production.
Yeah, and we'll get to a few examples, but it will become clear that a few of the differences, the subtle differences between your VO2 max is not the be all end all, because how much energy you produce aerobically is not solely dependent on that, I guess, or there is another factor that we'll talk about next, I guess, and which factors in to how much energy you use and what substrates you metabolize, and that second parameter is the lactate building rate, or VLaMax.
Yeah, so VLaMax is something you could simply define it as, so to speak, the counterpart of the VO2 max, which is a little bit kind of true when you look at the practical application in triathlon. Basically, what it says, so to speak, is, like you say, is a maximum lactate production rate. It's nothing else than actually, same as VO2 max. VO2 max is a marker for the maximum capacity or performance of your aerobic system. VLaMax is a marker for the maximum capacity of performance, better to say, of your glycolytic system. So, similar to the VO2 max, where I said, well, you can just take your biochemistry textbook and see that every time you produce energy or ATP in the aerobic metabolism, it goes along with the consumption of oxygen. You can take the same look into your same biochemistry textbook at the glycolysis, and you will see that every time you produce lactate in the glycolytic system, there's a production of ATP attached to that, so of energy. So same thing. VLaMax, or lactate production rate, is nothing more or less than a valid marker to understand what is the glycolytic or anaerobic energy production. We have different systems in our body to produce energy, and to assess aerobic system, it's VO2 max, and to assess anaerobic system or glycolytic system more precisely, it's VLaMax. Simple as that.
And VLaMax might be highly important to sort of maximize for athletes like sprinters in cycling teams. And if we give an example of where it becomes relevant to really have a high lactate building rate and be able to really tap into that system.
Yeah, I mean, that's on first glance obviously seems very logic, and that's what it is. Like you say, if you have short-term effort, you can take a sprinter and a cycling team, but even more obvious, maybe a 100-meter sprinter, or a 50 meters freestyler in swimming, or a football player who needs to run 40 meters to sprint. There obviously anaerobic energy production is of highly importance, and there obviously you need a high glycolytic energy production and thereby a high VLaMax. So that's definitely what it is. It's definitely that for those kind of sports, you see a high VLA-max in the athletes. You see a high glycolytic energy production because they directly need this power, this performance in order to perform.
Yeah, and this is something that for coaches, when we get new athletes, why it's quite important to know what sort of sports they have done previously. Let's say we have a new triathlete, but they've done some team sports or power sports before. It can be quite insightful already. You can infer a lot of the athlete from just getting to know what they've done in their past.
Yeah. You will see tremendously differences in VLA-max for those different kind of populations or types of athletes, so to speak. And you will also see it changing quite a lot. Whatever kind of training they're doing. So especially now in this time of the year, in the winter time, you have people who maybe spend some significant time training in the gym. And if you think about doing 15 repetitions with a high weight and a high speed, especially when you do it at high speed, that's a lot of power. That's a lot of power in a short amount of time. And this highly depends on your glycolytic system. So it's not uncommon to see recreational amateur triathletes or cyclists or runners coming off the off season, spending 3 or 4 months regular gym training, and then showing elevated VLA-max or elevated glycolytic capacities.
And if we tie it all together with FTP, can you explain what that really is, or anaerobic threshold, whatever you want to call it, and how it relates to VO2max and VLaMax?
Yeah, sure. So, FTP is kind of, the modern power training term for anaerobic threshold, right? That's where it comes from, functional threshold power. Basically what it is, it's this kind of old but still valid and important concept of there is an anaerobic threshold. There is an intensity. This is very good documented. There's an intensity, a maximum intensity at which, so to speak, your lactate level stabilizes. That's why it's also called the maximum lactate steady state. So it's an intensity where you can go, you can keep going to maximum intensity, which you can hold without accumulation of lactate and all the fatigue that goes along with that phenomenon. So it's related, it's not the same, but it's related to your 10K running speed, to your 1 hour time trial performance. And statistically, it's even related to your marathon running speed or half marathon running speed. And most people know about this. Everybody might have heard here about FTP and so on and so forth. Yet, the least amount of people ask the question, okay, why does it even exist? If my FTP is 300 watts, why is it at 300 watts? And why is the FTP of Tony Martin at 450 watts? And I'm not asking this question in terms of, because he's professional or because he is world champion. No, that's the other way around. He is world champion or has been world champion because his FTP is that high. So the question is, physiologically, what determines this threshold? And the truth is that your VO2max and your VLaMax determine approximately 97.5%. So almost all the power output at FTP is determined by these two systems. And basically why this is because your aerobic system basically defines how much lactate you can combust. Because this is how you combust lactate. Everybody knows that. You do an interval training, between the intervals, you do easy pedaling, easy running to combust lactate. So the aerobic system determines how much lactate you can combust. And your glycolytic system, your VLaMax, that's lactate production, right? So this determines how much lactate you produce. So these two combined, VO2max and VLaMax, determine what is your FTP, what is your threshold power. And therefore, if you want to train FTP, if you want to increase your FTP, you are better off understanding what is your VO2max or VLaMax, because then simplified, you can start to understand which knob, so to speak, you have to turn. Because
can you give an example or a couple of examples there with how like if we have two riders with the same FTP, for example. I know you did in a YouTube presentation that we can link to in the show notes. You had a great example of two riders with the same FTP but very different metabolic profiles. And
yeah, yeah. So, you can view that as basically your FTP, so to speak, is like, that's like how much money you have in your bank account, right? And then you can come to a certain amount of your bank account by having either earning more and spending more, or earning less and spending less, so to speak, right? So it's always this balance of these two systems. And it's funny. It's a funny special thing in endurance sport that people train for FTP and even pay people to help them work on this number, work on their power output, without these people trying to help them understand the mechanics behind it. What I'm trying to say is that I can go to a physiotherapist or I can go to a doctor and ask for a prescription. I get a rehabilitation program from my physiotherapist, or I get some kind of medication from my doctor. And I'm awaiting that they understand the mechanism why they are prescribing this kind of therapy. And the phenomenon we have in endurance sports a lot is that people are prescribing training programs without really knowing the mechanics on how this training program will work. It's more like, oh yeah, this has worked with 15 other athletes in the last 3 years, and therefore I think it should work with you. If this happens to me at a doctor or at a physiotherapist, I would not be happy, and hopefully we would also not be happy with that kind of answer. We say, yeah, but what is the mechanism? Why do I have to do this exercise? What is the mechanism? How and why does it help me to cure whatever my knee pain or my back pain or whatever my problem is? Or on a biochemistry level, why should I take this kind of medication? What does it do to my body to solve this issue? And this is, sorry for the long answer. And this is basically the same when it comes to FTP and VO2max and VLaMax. If you have a high VO2max, it will lift up your FTP power. And if you have a high VLaMax, it will decrease your FTP power. Okay? So, for example, you can have a 300 watts FTP for, let's say, 2 75 kilogram athletes. You can have an FTP of 300 watts with one athlete having a VO2max of 65 and a VLaMax of 0.3, for example, or 0.4. And another athlete might have the same FTP with whatever, a VO2max of 76, so close to a professional, but then maybe a VLaMax of 0.7. And if you don't know that, if you don't know what is behind this, how my FTP is created, what is the mechanism behind that, well, how can you really come up with a very precise and focused training program? Because with one athlete, you would maybe want to decrease the VLaMax because the VO2max is already super high. And with the other athlete, you already have a low VLaMax and you maybe want to increase the VO2max, right? So two completely different training programs you would prescribe for those kind of athletes.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get into the training in just a little bit, but just to wrap up what you said there, you talked earlier about turning one of two knobs. You have the VO2max knob and the VLaMax knob. And for that first rider that had the low VLaMax, but also lower VO2max compared to the other rider, you would probably want to turn the VO2max knob. And for that second rider that had a professional level VO2max, but a high VLaMax, if you want to increase their FTP, you want to turn that VLaMax knob and you want to turn it down so that you can elevate that FTP. And so this is just to summarize what you said there. Just as a side note, I used to work in medical devices, and I've interacted a lot with medical doctors, and it's quite clear to me now that unfortunately they don't really know at all times why they're prescribing what they're doing. But somebody has made a decision, and there are some regulations in place. What are the typical procedure for treating certain symptoms and certain diseases? So that's why they do what they're doing. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. Maybe it's different in Germany, but that's the way it works.
Well, but somebody who made this decision understands the mechanism.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no medication coming to the market saying, oh, we have some kind of, chemical substance here. Let's see what it does, and then we can see how we use it. It's the other way around. We understand the mechanism, what it does, and then we prescribe it for different therapies.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so before we get into the training discussion, let's talk about substrate utilization as well. And aerobically, we use carbohydrates and fats for energy. And how does the interplay between VO2 max and VLA max determine how those substrates are used as fuel?
Yeah, so this goes a little bit back to, when we introduced VLaMax today, and we said, yeah, that's glycolytic energy, and that's important for your sprinter and your football player and your whatever. And maybe some people then turned off and say, yeah, but I'm a triathlete, I don't care, right? I don't need to sprint. That's true. And for that reason, you would not be interested. You would not be interested in your VLaMax. On the other hand, for example, there's this quote, let's say, from the coach of Jan Frodeno saying, you need to know what you need to work on when you know the VLaMax, right? And the reason for this is, and the reason why you should care as an Ironman triathlete or as a 7.3 or even as Olympic distance or half marathon, why you should care is because the VLaMax, so your glycolytic system, if it's trained better, if it's a higher capacity, if your VLaMax is higher, if you can produce more energy in the anaerobic or glycolytic pathway, that means that you need a substrate, you need a fuel to do that. And this is glucose. The only source of energy, the only substrate your muscle or your body can use to produce lactate in the glycolysis to produce energy there is glucose. And that means that the higher your glycolytic system is trained and developed, and therefore the higher the VLaMax is, the higher your glucose utilization is. And this is true also in sub-maximum conditions. This is true also in endurance conditions. So long story short, if you have, as an athlete, if you have a high VLaMax, it means not only that you can produce a lot of power in a short amount of time, it also means that in endurance sports like endurance running, endurance cycling, endurance swimming, your metabolism depends more on glucose, and therefore you burn more of this precious fuel and you use less fat. And there obviously it becomes super important for any triathlete, for like the performance in a triathlon.
Yeah. So as an example, if we have two athletes with the same FTP, we have these same two athletes that we talked about, but they have different VO2 max and VLA max, and they both go and do an Ironman. They ride at the same intensity, whatever that is. Let's say 70% of FTP, and then the one rider that has that 0.9, the high VLA max, is going to be oxidizing a lot more carbohydrate than the one that has a 0.3 VLA max.
Exactly. So the easy way to understand it is that glucose or pyruvate or lactate is a primary fuel. Whenever you have a lot of this going on, whenever your metabolism is producing a lot of energy by using glucose, so every time you produce a lot of lactate, so to speak, you're not burning fat. And let me add this, every athlete out there knows that. If you as an athlete do a hard interval training and you do some easy effort in between the intervals. Let's stick to our example. We have an FTP of 300 watts, which means maybe our fat metabolism or base training or long, slow distance training, whatever you want to call that, you maybe do at 200 watts or 180 watts. Let's say you do a hard interval training. You do 4 by 4 minutes at 330, 340 watts with 6 minutes in recovery at this 180, 200 watts. Normally, this is the power output you would see for your long, slow distance training, and you assume you burn a lot of fat. However, everybody somehow knows that in the 6 minutes as a recovery, even though you are at the low intensity for your long, slow distance training, you're not burning any fat because you're only doing this rest, you're doing this recovery, not only, but partly because you want to burn those lactate. So what this tells you already, what I'm trying to say here is whenever there's lactate, and whenever there's a lot of lactate production, a lot of lactate concentration, you're not using fat. Okay, and this is the same mechanism. Your body, it's much, much easier for your muscles to use glucose and pyruvate or lactate. So whenever this is present, whenever this is there, you're using less fat. You can also say just the lactate the glucose pushes the fat out of the metabolism. So whenever this system is strongly developed, less fat burning. And this obviously is a highly performance limiting factor for any triathlon.
And this also brings me to a point which I think is quite important. Let's say you're supposed to go out for an endurance ride where you want to use mostly the maximum amount of fat that you can for fuel. So you're at that 180 to 200 watts, and maybe you're in a group, or perhaps you're alone, but you've come up to some Strava segments that you want to do a KOM on, and you do like a 2-minute. You think, well, it's just 2 minutes out of my 2-hour ride, so what does it matter? But what happens after that 2-minute effort is that you're actually losing a lot more than just that 2 minutes, because after that you have a lot of lactate that is going to be used preferentially for fuel.
Exactly. And again, if you are, like in this example, if you are in a kind of a group ride scenario, or at least you're outside with your buddy or two or three other guys, it can differ vastly between those guys, right? Like for one athlete in this Strava segment, he ends up at a lactate production and a lactate concentration which shuts down his fat combustion for 10 minutes, and another guy only for 2 minutes. So, right? That's not even then. It's not even those. So what I'm trying to say, even though the effort is maybe the same for all 3-4 guys in this group, the effect it has and what it does to the fat metabolism can be vastly different between those 3 guys.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about training and sort of the conclusions we can draw about training from this discussion. The first thing that I want to ask about is it's quite common to see workouts prescribed as percentages of FTP, but based on discussion that we've had with athletes having highly individual different metabolisms, what can we talk about, and what can we conclude based on about that sort of training that is based on purely percentages of FTP?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that percentage of FTP historically comes from percentage of lactate threshold or percentage of any lactate concentration you would see in a lactate profile test in the lab. This is like historically where it comes from. And it works in terms of a practical application. It's a practical way to do things, and it works to some extent. On the other hand, it has its limitations, and there's a systematic limitation which is implied by it. The FTP, or your threshold power, is, as we now understanding that's created by VLaMax and VO2max, your FTP power is not directly related to one single metabolic system. So it's not like you can say, I'm training at whatever 60% of my VO2 max, which implies I put a 60% strain on my system. And this is what it's done in scientific research, right? If you take out scientific research papers, training intensity are normally prescribed as a percentage of VO2 max, because it helps you much better understand how much stress you put on your aerobic system. And if you look to weight training, if you look to training in the gym, things are based on 1 repetition maximum, right? And then it is based on this one specific exercise. So you are basing, in gym training, for example, you base your intensity or your training for, let's say, squats. You base on your 1 repetition maximum in squatting. Obviously, it sounds stupid, but it's that simple. You don't base your squat training on your 1 repetition maximum in the bench press, obviously, because you understand it's a different system, right? It's upper body muscles versus lower body muscles. And this is a problem with basing your training on FTP. It is not a clear link to one or the other metabolic system. So when you train at 110% or 80% of FTP, it is invisible. It is not possible to understand how much stress you put on your aerobic system, on your glycolytic system, or on your fat metabolism system. Because your fat max can be at 80% of FTP or can be at 65% of FTP. And your VO2 max can be at 120% of FTP or at 145% of FTP. So if you base your system, obviously, if you base your training on FTP, you have no idea, sorry to say, but that's frankly the truth. You have no idea how much stress you put on those systems which affect your FTP. And then you end up having, and this is what you see in reality, you put 10 people or whatever, let's say you put 10 people on the same training program, same percentage of FTP, and what you get as a result, every coach knows that. Like what you get as a result, that 5 people develop in this direction, 5 people develop in a totally other direction. Because the actual training stimulus they might have gotten out of that on the aerobic and glycolytic system can be completely different.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So it all comes back to what we talked about, turning the knob that you should be turning based on your profile. So if we go into that, then if the knob we need to turn is the VO2 max one, and we want to improve that, what are some training methods we can use to do that?
Well, the simple answer is everything. The simple answer is that you have to understand that whenever you work out, whenever you do endurance training, the longer you go, the longer the stress or the stimulus is that you apply to your aerobic system, and the harder you go, the higher the stimulus is. So it is known that you can. It's very well known and very good documented in the peer-reviewed literature. You can just increase your training volume, right? To a certain extent, obviously. To a certain extent, you just train more and you will see a good increase in your aerobic capacity and your VO2 max. And lately, obviously, which is at the moment pretty popular, I'd say, is like high-intensive training, interval training. Yeah, you increase intensity and your VO2 max will also go up. Maybe not so much in the highly professional, highly trained athletes, but at least in like the average population of like amateur and recreational. So, everything, so to speak, has a stimulus on your VO2 max, because whatever you do, you use a system, and therefore there's a training stimulus. The more important question, so to speak, and the more difficult question is, what training should I preferably doing? If I can choose, right? Because I maybe have to work and have some other things in my daily routine which I need to take care of instead for only triathlon training. So the more important question is, what should I focus on? And there's no easy answer to that. However, it is known that depending on what your muscle fiber phenotype is, like you have slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, and depending on how this contribution is, you may react a little bit better to more like the long, slow distance training, or you maybe react a little bit better to like the high intensive interval kind of trainings. And the good thing is that the muscle fiber distribution is a little bit implied also by the VLaMax. So we have a lot of coaches who actually use the VLaMax to make an informed decision if an athlete will, benefit more from like shorter, high intense efforts, or if an athlete benefits most likely a little bit more from, the long, slow distance training. But in general,
so with the more with the slow twitch type of athlete, then benefit more from long, slow distance training.
Yes, that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay, and VLaMax, if we want to decrease that, which I guess will be the most common in a triathlon population, how can we do that?
Well, in VLaMax, it's a little bit more complicated, so to speak. If you want to decrease it, even though it maybe sounds stupid, the first answer is avoid anything that increases it. It sounds a little bit too stupid simple, but that's really what it is. So what I'm trying to say here is, like I said a couple of minutes ago, for example, gym training, high intense gym training is a very good glycolytic, a very high anaerobic stimulus. So obviously you would not want to include this type of training into a training regime which is targeting a decreasing VLaMax, right? You would not do this with anything else. You would not try to prescribe two training methods which have different stimulus. So the first answer is avoid anything that triggers an increasing VLaMax, like gym training, like sprint training, short, intensive, high power sprints. Avoid that. And then if you are actively trying to decrease it, it's important to understand the principle of the glycolysis and understand. We have to go a little bit towards the understanding the muscle fiber types. So the vast majority of glycolytic energy production is happening in the more fast twitch fibers. So as we said, there are slow twitch and fast twitch fibers, and the majority of the glycolytic metabolism happens in the fast twitch fibers. Now, the fast twitch fibers have a higher threshold of recruitment, which means if you are only going super easy, right? If you're only going 40% of your threshold or 30% of VO2 max, like, super, super easy, you are not recruiting those fibers. And if you are not recruiting the fibers, you cannot expect the fiber to adapt, right? Similar thing, again, if I go to the gym and I only do leg squats, I cannot expect my upper body to become stronger, right? Because I'm not training it. So the first thing is you have to have a certain minimum amount of training intensity to even recruit those fibers, to even recruit those guys who are responsible for your high lactate production. So this means in a practical application, you need to have a training intensity which is, in the range of like 80-90% of threshold or 70-65% of VO2 max. This is when you start using those FT fibers. And then you need to provide the stimulus which allows you to basically have an endurance stimulus. So you cannot go super hard because then you cannot go long enough. This means this kind of sweet spot, how it's called today, or above sweet spot kind of training, a little bit below threshold, trying to do some kind of endurance exercises in this intensity. This helps a lot if you do this like continuously several times a week over a course of several weeks or months. This will help you normally decrease the VLaMax. And then you can help this a little bit by nutrition, right? Obviously, you can imagine if I'm trying to lower lactate production and glucose utilization, doesn't make a lot of sense to feed myself on a high glucose diet. So what you would do then is, I'm not saying no carbohydrates, but you would try to restrict and be mindful about not doing this kind of training with like fully replenished glycogen stores and not like with a fully carbohydrate substitution, so to speak.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, it sounds like if we are trying to improve VO2 max, our training intensity distribution might be a bit more polarized, and for the VLA max, it's a bit more all packed in the middle, so to say, sweet spot and that sort of.
Yeah, if you want to simplify it like this, I think it's oversimplified, but to be honest, I think this is one reason why you have people out there saying, oh, you need to have polarized training, right? Because it maybe favors your in development of VO2 max, and therefore maybe people have good experience with that, have seen good results, and therefore say, yeah, you need to be polarized training because this allows you to have, like you say, the short, intense stuff and the long, slow distance stuff. And then you might have another group of people who have done a lot of like sweet spot, medio, subthreshold, maybe low RPM, strength endurance, carbohydrate restrictive sweet spot training, and have a very good experience with that, because basically the mechanism here is they lowered the VLaMax and therefore they see an increase in endurance performance, and they are proposing that kind of training. And the truth, actually, how I see it also from experience and from working with a lot of coaches and a lot of coaching businesses all over the world, is that as always, if you have two things you can see in the real world which work, there must be something right with these two concepts. And it seems that the one concept is true because those people who have good experience see a decrease in VLaMax, and the other people who have a good experience with the polarized training see maybe some good improvements in VO2 max.
Yeah. And that's also like, it's not going to be the same your entire career necessarily. Maybe that's what you mentioned. Dan Lodang, Jan Frodeno's coach, he was here in Lisbon holding a 2-day seminar where he talked about a lot of these things last week as we're recording this, so late January, early February. And what he said very specifically, that what worked last year might not work this year. So So that, for example, let's say you do an entire year of sweet spot, that might work fantastic. But maybe you started at a very high VLA max, and then throughout the year you managed to lower it, and then maybe it's not the best thing for you to do next year. Maybe that's not the knob that you should be turning.
Exactly. And where this goes back to is also, remember what we said, that your VLA max implies a little bit of your muscle fiber distribution, and that we said that your muscle fiber distribution dictates what is the most effective training for your VO2 max. So what this means is, if you do a year of like training which lowered your VLA max, you might see, or you will see some extent, a shift in muscle fiber distribution. And then therefore, the training, like even if you benefit, let's say you benefit 1 year from the high intense interval training in terms of increasing VO2 max, now you change your muscle fiber distribution a little bit. And now you would benefit more from some lower intensity, long, slow distance training to increase your VO2 max even further. Right?
Yeah, very good.
So this is a mechanism which is going on if you look at recreational amateur athletes in a course of like 3-4 years of training. Some people, I hear and talk a lot about with people who get this kind of frustration. And I said, I have a background of coaching not only professionals, but coaching and working with recreational amateur athletes for more than 10 years. And that's what you see. People have this frustration after 3-4 years or 5 years or whatsoever. They don't see the same improvements anymore. And they said, yeah, I tried this training, and this worked, and now it doesn't work anymore. And the other thing worked before, it also doesn't work anymore. Yeah, because you are lost in between these mechanics, and without looking behind the curtain, so to speak, you don't see what's going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Finally, not necessarily relevant for most triathletes listening to this, but for other endurance athletes, that there are some of them listening for sure, like cyclists of various disciplines. If we are in a situation where we want to increase VLA max, can you just quickly cover off some methods for that?
Well, same thing around. First answer is avoid anything that decreases it, right? So avoid your mid-range intensity, low carbohydrate intake endurance exercises, right? Best example, and you talk about cycling, look at the Tour de France. The sprint on the Champs-Élysées on the last week after 3 weeks of racing, the maximum power is decreased in almost all athletes because their glycolytic capacity is decreased. Why is that? Well, 3 weeks Tour de France, it's the best recipe to decrease your VLA max, because you're never glycogen replenished, right? Even one rest day is not enough. You're never glycogen replenished, and you spend a lot of times riding through the mountains, mid-intensity, lowered RPM, which is another good way to increase the recruitment of FT fibers in the mid-range intensity. So avoid this. And then look towards this polarized training, right? Avoid this mid-range. Either have very low intensity endurance training. Think about track cycling sprinters. That's what they're doing, right? If they ride outside, very low intensity. And combine this with, high intense, high power, high speed gym training, sprint training. Make sure you're always glycogen replenished. And yeah, either don't you use your FT fibers, or if you use it, use them in a way where you have this high power output, high glycolytic energy turnover to actually trigger that system to increase its capacity.
Yeah. And nutrition, you mentioned a little bit about how we can use glycogen non-replenished training and replenished to increase or decrease and increase VLA max. What are some other nutritional considerations or even interventions that we can use to help our training goals as it relates to these topics that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. This is glycogen, and it's important to understand again that not glycogen replenished is something different than glycogen depleted, right? So there's a very big difference. So let me get this straight. Not being completely glycogen replenished is a small add-on. It is really just a little extra, so to speak, in terms of training stimulus to work on the VLA max. Besides that, obviously, There's been a lot of stories and ideas and concepts around like low carbohydrate training and carbohydrate restricted training and how good of a stimulus this is on your VO2 max. And the truth is that on a molecular level, on a transcription level, if you look to gene activation, which are involved in mitochondrial biogenesis, this is where it all comes from. And on this level, it works great. If you look at the performance outcome of carbohydrate restricted, high fat, low carbohydrate, or even no carbohydrate diet, if you look at the performance outcome, especially in not professional athletes, the data is pretty weak in terms of not showing you big improvements. There's a lot of studies recently coming out of the so-called Supernova project from Down Under, where you can see that there's no effect. Even if you do periodized nutrition, it's very, very difficult to see an effect. And I'm not saying that it's not working at all. I'm just saying that for the audience maybe out there, I would be super, super careful, because when you look at this data, you can see that out of maybe 20 athletes doing that, in average, it is not working. In average, it's not working. It only works in single athletes. And it's important to understand when you read about the professionals doing that, some professional triathletes are doing high-fat diet and some Tour de France winners doing that or whatsoever. It's important to understand that for us working in this area, working in this high-performance sport, we don't care about what the science says if in average a method worked or not. We don't care about if we improve the average performance of an athlete by 5%. We care about improving the performance of this one athlete, of this one Chris Froome by 1%. And there are athletes who react like this to these kind of special nutrition things. And maybe, or for sure, some athletes do, some recreational, some amateur athletes do. But if you want to go down this road to do some specific nutrition regimes, I would strongly recommend to monitor this with like regular VO2max and VLaMax assessment or body composition assessments and fat max and so on. Because again, it's becoming very, very popular, and it's becoming very popular because people are looking to performance or high performance sports. But again, the aim and the idea why it's used in high performance sports is totally different. And when I was coaching a professional bike team, we were using these methods. And you mentioned Dan Lorang, he's using these methods in Bora, but only with single athletes. There's not this like, oh yeah, let's put everybody on a low carb diet or something. That's normally not happening.
Yeah, and you mentioned something there at the beginning that I think is very important. You mentioned it being like a small percentage of the improvements that you can make. So if the goal is performance, like we should perhaps put a bit more effort and mental cognitive energy into thinking about how we train rather than about how many macronutrients of each or how many calories of each macronutrient we eat, since that's going to be the thing that is of big importance, and then nutritional interventions might be the icing on the cake that might work for some.
Exactly.
So let's wrap up by you telling us more about your software INSCYD and what it does and how it can help athletes to train with more knowledge and awareness of these things.
Well, I'm not giving you the sales pitch here. I mean, I obviously could do, but I don't see that this way. But yeah, let's explain a little bit what it is. So INSCYD is a software which launched publicly about 1.5 years ago. As you mentioned, it's been mentioned initially with the swimming federations or swimming teams. It has been used in other sports, or it has been used in professional sports already before. Actually, the methods and the concept and the knowledge behind it has been used for more than a decade in different swimming federations and also in professional cycling. You mentioned Dan, who is one of the guy who embraces these kind of principles in INSCYD. So I'm just trying to say there has been a pretty long track record. And what it basically is, on a high level explanation, it is a pretty big, so to speak, algorithms engine, which is made of basic fundamental exercise physiology knowledge. So everything you see in INSCYD comes from several peer-reviewed studies, so to speak. And what it does, it is like, it is a software which is debunking or showing you the composition of the performance of an athlete. So it basically looks, that's why the name is coming from, it looks inside the body, it looks inside your athlete to understand how energy is composed. How is your FTP composed? Aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism. How is your performance sub-FTP composed? How much fat do you burn? How much carbohydrate do you burn? Think about running and swimming especially. It is looking at your running economy. It is looking at, okay, how much energy do you really have? That's one question. But on the other hand, how fast can you run with that? Same on the bike, right? How much power do you produce, but how fast do you ride with that? Are you more aerodynamic, less aerodynamic? So this is all combined in one big software, so to speak, right? Body composition is in there. So the software is able to tell you what you need to do to increase your performance. Should you work on body composition? Should you lose body weight? How much benefit you get from this, let's say, for your marathon time? Should you work on either increasing your VO2 max or work on your running economy? These are the things that the software answers you. And this is what coaches for like professional athletes, professional teams, but also for amateur athletes are using it for, right? So it is a software which is used by coaches, by human performance labs, by teams, by federation to analyze the performance of the athlete, to understand, like I said, what they should work on, like which field does offer the biggest room for improvement, and then use it along the way of training to monitor the progress, right? Let's say identify, I want to work on my VLaMax, for example, and then you create a training program to work on your VLaMax, and then you can reuse INSCYD, you can retest and find out, okay, how efficient is my training going? How quickly is my athlete dropping his VLaMax in order, for example, to increase his fat combustion?
Yeah, and I used it for about a month now, and I'm super impressed. I've tested myself and use it in my own training as well as with my athletes, and it's definitely eye-opening when you get this inside view of your athlete's metabolism. how much I started to realize like how much you're actually guessing when you don't have this information. It almost feels like cheating, when you get this information that you didn't have before. So
thank you.
Yeah. But we'll post some links in the show notes and the episode description so that listeners can go and check it out in more detail.
Sure.
Is there anything else that you want to mention or talk about before we move into the rapid fire questions?
Well, I think I maybe have talked already too much. I hope people did not fall asleep here. No, I mean, if you want to keep asking or wrap it up, that's fine with me.
Okay, so these rapid fire questions should be quick, one sentence or so, starting with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports?
I don't think I have one, to be honest. There is not one, especially when it comes to endurance sports. I tend to try to look to other sports and other fields of science and research and try to learn from them and try to learn what others are doing. I have good friends in the world of team sports, of soccer. I go to those kind of conferences, read literature and books from other fields, from other sciences. And I appreciate that, and then think about how this relates maybe to my own field of expertise.
And what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Honestly, I think endurance sports. The habit of, so to speak, having been through training a lot and pushing my own limits and staying on the bike longer and staying out there swimming and running, because I did triathlon myself. I forgot to mention that, and cycling. Learn to really build the stamina and don't stop, don't give up. That's maybe the most important thing.
And finally, who's somebody in endurance sports or in any field really that you can choose that you admire and look up to?
That's difficult. I refuse to give you one name. There have been several people on my way in the last years. I have been happy to work with from a business perspective. And from a work perspective, I would name somebody like Bob Stapleton, who was my manager at HTC, for sure. I had people in the science world I really like working with, and I've learned a lot from. And from a coaching perspective, the honest answer, for example, somebody I really have a high opinion on, we mentioned already, is Dan Lorang. It's a little bit funny story. He was one of my interns about 10 years ago, and he was still at university. And now he is really deep into coaching, not only the professional cycling, but obviously also triathlon. And I think he does a tremendous good job there. And I really respect him for a lot of the skills he has and how he coaches people. From also psychological aspect and how he approaches things. So even though I have been a coach myself in a similar field, I think he's doing a tremendous good job there.
Brilliant. Finally, where is the best place for people to follow you or follow INSCYD? Social media, website, any outlets that you want to plug, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, INSCYD has a Facebook page, and I think also an Instagram, and we also do some things on Twitter. So yeah, feel free to follow us there. I really invite you to do so. You will get a mix of content, of information, and news and update. And then again, without giving you the sales pitch here, for either coaches and athletes, I would really recommend the blog. There's really some, I think, really valid content in the blog, and we're also starting to do webinars. You will find some webinars from us. So if you are in our email list, mostly all webinars until now are for free. Even though with people like Dan Lorang or other high-profile coaches out of the world of endurance sports, they do free webinars for us. So follow that, and then you might even see like a learning platform from INSCYD where you can get a lot of information. And so even though again, without wanting to give you the sales pitch here, I think especially for triathlon, you will find a lot of useful information. I hope that you can enjoy in the blog on our website.
Yeah, no, it's a great blog. I've read most of the articles on there, and the webinars are good as well. I've seen quite a few of them. If I can make one request, it is to make the recordings available, because it's not always possible to catch them live. So that would be my one request.
Yeah, no, that's definitely coming. We just published the one recording we had about saving time in an Ironman, like a multidiscipline approach, including aerodynamics and biomechanics. We just published that 2 days or 3 days ago.
Yeah, I saw that, so I hope that's the start of a new trend.
Yeah, and there's more coming. The one with Dan Lorang is going to be published. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's been a real pleasure talking as usual, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with the listeners here.
I thank you for having me. You have a good one.
All right, so that was quite a doozy of an interview, I think. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. I spent a ton of time trying to learn about these things in the last few months or so already that I've been starting to work on with these concepts that we discussed. And I've been in touch with Sebastian over already for a year, I think, is when I first learned about INSCYD and first talked with Sebastian of it and how it can potentially have huge benefits for all endurance athletes, whether you're professional or age grouper. My key takeaways for you from this episode is that if you don't know your VO2 max and your VLA max, you can make educated guesses for how to improve your performance. And whether you think of performance in terms of FTP or perhaps something like performance at Ironman intensity, but those are still educated guesses. When you do know these two, it feels almost like cheating. And I know this because that's what I now know for myself and for many of my athletes already that I coach. now I know which knob to turn, so to say. And it all becomes so much easier, and it feels absolutely brilliant to be able to have the stronger confidence, I guess, in the training that you're doing when you actually have this sort of detailed insight into what your physiology is. You can narrow down your number of options so massively in terms of what training is right and not right for you. So as a personal example, I found when I did the testing that my VLA max is already 0.30, so that's perfect for long distance triathlon. It's I don't want it to go any lower. So that means that if I want to improve, I need to improve my VO2 max. And that is exactly what I'm focusing on at the moment. And this means two things for me, focusing on a high volume of training, and the quality sessions that I do, I prioritize doing VO2 max intervals. It doesn't mean for everybody that VO2 max intervals is necessarily the right thing to do. Sebastian talked about the fact that there's a lot of things that can improve VO2 max, but this is my first line approach, I guess, or the number one priority is still the total volume at aerobic intensity, which is everything up to VO2 max. But now I'm doing this block with VO2 max intervals. I might try threshold intervals next, depending on what I find in my next testing, how much I improved or did not improve. But this is how I can narrow down my choices significantly. At least I know that most likely the sweet spot work that I've been doing so far in my career has probably helped me get that VLA max down to a low level. But now it is there. I don't need to get it any lower. So sweet spot training, especially sweet spot with low cadence, is not necessarily going to be the best thing for me right now when I want to improve my performance. So my, I guess, short list of things to choose from has become much shorter, and it's all about then just choosing what you do and then reassessing and see whether you improved or not. And that's what I'm doing right now, and I feel very confident in the way that things are going. I actually feel a lot stronger now in my training than I did compared to what I did only 3 or 4 weeks ago by the time of this recording. And a lot of things have changed, and I completely changed my training, my bike training at least, based on those results. So this episode was quite detailed, and as usual, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com and find all of those details. If you have comments or questions, then you can leave them on that episode as well. Remember that I do get a lot of questions already from the athletes that I coach, etc. So I can't sort of be a coach to everybody. I try to be a coach to everybody at one time through the Q&A podcasts and the podcast in general, but also the comment section is a place where there is that leverage of sort of anybody can see the questions and get them answered there. So that's why I might not be able to answer your question individually, except for if you submit it as a podcast question, but in the comment section, I will be able to get to it. As I mentioned also, I will link to the Q&A number 20, which had additional discussions about these topics, and also we'll link to that video that we talked about that Sebastian did at the Colorado workshop with INSCYD. I also want to mention that by the time you hear this episode, I should have my own remote testing service with the INSCYD software up and running. To be clear, INSCYD is not a software that athletes can go and sign up for. You need to be a coach to be signed up for that and then administer the test to your athletes. So I'm signed up for that. I've done the test now for some time with my own coached athletes, but now I'm opening it up to anybody, and it's pretty easy. You can read more about it on scientifictriathlon.com/testing, and I have some videos as well that will explain what you do and what you get, what the results are, and how you can benefit from it as well. Of course, I'll link to that page in the show notes, and it will be available in the menu bar of scientifictriathlon.com as well. And I have plenty of information there, like a direct comparison with what you get with this type of testing compared to doing lab testing, etc. So there's all the information should be on that page, but if there's something that you can't find any answers to, then of course email me or send me a message and with your specific questions, if it's right for you or not, And I'll get back to you, and we can figure out whether this is a good way to go for you. And it's important to remember, this is a test that you don't need to go to a lab for. You only need your bike and your power meter. You can do it on the road or on the indoor trainer. So it's a critical power test that you can do virtually. Then you just send in your workout data to me. I do some analysis. I basically see what the different powers that should be used by the algorithm are, and then I input it into the algorithm, into the software, and it does the number crunching, and you get a result. And regardless of which sort of pricing level you go for, I have 3 different levels depending on the amount of individual support you require. But regardless of which package, you will get plenty of information and about how to actually apply that information in your training so that you can benefit from it. So it's not just pretty numbers and charts. You will get that information pack with, depending on your scenario, your results, your physiology, what is the training that you should be doing. So that's the whole idea with this testing. And that's something that one of the things, I guess, that you would typically not get in a lab. And again, that URL, if you want to go and check it out directly, is scientifictriathlon.com/testing. Big thanks to our sponsor, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to find your individual hydration strategy, and use the coupon code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, and this will give you your first box if you're a new customer, perhaps from New Zealand or Australia, which Precision Hydration has now started delivering to. Then you will get your first box for free with that promo code. Thank you as always for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.